January 14, 1942, about 2200 off the coast of Long Island, New York. The Atlantic Ocean is black, cold, and deceptively calm, masking the machinery of war gliding just beneath the surface. Through the periscope of U-123, Captain Lieutenant Reinhard Hardegen looks out not at a darkened fortress, but at a carnival of light. The American eastern seaboard is blazing. The glow of coastal cities, boardwalks, and lighthouses illuminates the horizon, casting the silhouettes of passing merchant ships into sharp, undeniable relief against the night sky. For the German crew, who have crossed the treacherous mid-Atlantic to reach these waters, the sight is surreal. They have arrived at the doorstep of the industrial giant, and the giant is asleep. In Hardegen's crosshairs is the Norness, a Norwegian tanker carrying a vital cargo of oil. The tanker is running with her navigation lights on, adhering to peacetime regulations that have no place in this new reality. Hardegen gives the order. The torpedo leaves the tube with a hiss of compressed air, racing toward the unsuspecting hull. When it strikes, the explosion does more than shatter the steel plates of the Norness. It shatters the illusion of American invulnerability. The tanker lists and begins its slow, agonizing descent to the bottom, marking the first kill of Operation Paukenschlag, Operation Drumbeat. The war for the Atlantic has officially arrived in American waters. This attack was not a random act of violence, but the opening note of a carefully orchestrated symphony of destruction planned by Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz. Dönitz, the mastermind of the U-boat arm, understood the brutal mathematics of the Atlantic campaign better than anyone. His strategy was not necessarily to defeat the Allied navies in a traditional gunnery duel, but to sever the lifeline that kept Great Britain alive. The United Kingdom, an island nation, required over 55 million tons of imported food, fuel, and raw materials annually just to survive and fight. If the U-boats could sink ships faster than the Allies could build them, the grim calculus known as the Battle of the Tonnage, Britain would starve, and the staging ground for the liberation of Europe would collapse. For the men of the U-boat service, the early months of 1942 would become known as the Second Happy Time. It was a period of unprecedented success, rivaling the early days of the war against Britain. The American coast, from the chill waters of New England to the tropical currents of the Caribbean, became a hunting ground. The U-boats found a maritime infrastructure completely unprepared for modern submarine warfare. There were no blackouts. There were no coastal convoys. Merchant ships sailed alone, often on predictable schedules, silhouetted against the neon glow of Miami or the streetlights of Atlantic City, making target acquisition almost effortless for the German commanders. But the violence that erupted off Long Island in January 1942 had been simmering in the North Atlantic for months, in a shadowy, undeclared war that tested the resolve of American sailors long before the formal declaration of hostilities. To understand the catastrophe of Operation Drumbeat, one must look back to the icy, gray swells of October 1941. The United States, while officially neutral, had been escorting Allied convoys in the Western Atlantic as far as Iceland since September of that year. It was a political tightrope walk that placed American destroyers directly in the path of German torpedoes. On October 17, 1941, the destroyer USS Carney was screening convoy SC-48 south of Iceland. The convoy, a typical assembly of slow-moving merchant vessels, was under siege by a wolf pack, a coordinated group of U-boats designed to overwhelm escorts. In the chaos of the night engagement, U-568 fired a torpedo that struck the Carney on her starboard side. The explosion tore through the forward boiler room, killing 11 American sailors instantly. These were among the first U.S. military casualties of the Atlantic War, men killed in defense of a lifeline that their country had not yet officially sworn to protect. The Carney survived, limping back to port, a steel testament to the escalating danger. 2 weeks later, the luck of the U.S. Navy ran out. On October 31, the destroyer USS Reuben James, an older four-piper destroyer, was positioning herself to investigate a direction-finding bearing near a convoy. A torpedo from U-552 slammed into her forward magazine. The result was catastrophic. The entire bow of the ship was blown off, and the vessel sank rapidly into the freezing ocean. Of the crew, 115 men were lost. The sinking of the Reuben James sent a shockwave through the American public, immortalized in song and headlines, but it was merely a prelude. When Germany formally declared war on the United States following Pearl Harbor, the restraints were removed. The U-boats were no longer restricted to the mid-Atlantic. They were free to bring the war to the American coast. And bring it they did. Following the sinking of the Norness, the slaughter intensified. The German captains, operating thousands of miles from their bases in occupied France, found the pickings so rich they could afford to be choosy, expending their precious torpedoes only on high-value targets like tankers and large freighters. On January 19, 1942, just 5 days after the Norness went down, Hardegen and U-123 were prowling off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina. This stretch of ocean, where the warm Gulf Stream meets the cold Labrador Current, is treacherous enough in peacetime. In war, it became a graveyard. Hardegen spotted the U.S. tanker Alan Jackson, laden with crude oil. The attack was executed with ruthless precision. The torpedo strike ignited the cargo, turning the ship into a floating inferno. The blaze was so intense, and the attack so close to shore, that the flames were witnessed by civilians standing on the beaches of North Carolina. They watched in horror as 22 merchant mariners perished in the fire and the sea. The war was no longer a distant headline. It was burning on the horizon. The spectacle of burning tankers became a grim nightly routine along the Outer Banks, a stretch of coast that sailors soon christened Torpedo Junction. The geography that made Cape Hatteras a navigational hazard in peacetime, the narrow shipping lanes forced between the shoals and the open ocean, created a shooting gallery for the U-boat commanders. They simply had to sit on the bottom during the day, waiting for the screws of the heavy traffic to pass overhead, and surface at night to execute their targets. By March 1942, the carnage had reached a fever pitch. On the night of March 17, Captain Lieutenant Johann Mohr, commanding U-124, demonstrated the terrifying efficiency of a veteran crew operating in an undefended environment. Mohr was already an ace, a man who wore his knight's cross with the casual confidence of a hunter who knows his prey has nowhere to run. Prowling off Cape Hatteras, U-124 engaged a loose formation of unescorted ships. In a single, relentless night of violence, Mohr maneuvered his Type IX boat with surgical precision, firing torpedoes that claimed 4 tankers and a steamer. To the German High Command, these were merely tonnage statistics, marks on a chart in a bunker in Lorient. To the Allies, it was a strategic hemorrhage. In the first 5 months of 1942 alone, 129 tankers were sent to the bottom in American waters. The United States was losing ships faster than its shipyards could lay keels. The Battle of the Tonnage was tilting dangerously in Germany's favor. During this first half of the year, U-boats sank 360 merchant ships in U.S. waters, totaling a staggering 2,250,000 gross tons. The human cost of this tonnage war fell squarely on the shoulders of the U.S. Merchant Marine. These men were civilians, bakers, mechanics, college students, and career salts, thrust into the front lines of a war where they had no armor and, initially, no guns. They sailed on floating bombs, ships laden with high-octane aviation fuel, ammunition, and crude oil. The casualty rate was appalling. 1 in 26 merchant mariners would not survive the war, a higher death rate than the Marine Corps or the Navy. They died in the freezing slush of the North Atlantic, choked by bunker oil, or incinerated in the flash fires of Caribbean tanker strikes. Yet the ships kept sailing. They had to. Britain was starving, and the Soviet Union was desperate for supplies. It took until May 1942 for the tactical situation to shift. Under immense pressure from the mounting losses and the British Admiralty, who had learned the hard lessons of convoy tactics in 1917 and 1940, the U.S. Navy finally instituted an interlocking convoy system along the East Coast. The Bucket Brigade, as it was sometimes called, organized merchant traffic into protected columns escorted by destroyers, Coast Guard cutters, and converted yachts. The effect was immediate. The second happy time for the U-boats came to an abrupt end. Denied their easy kills off Florida and New Jersey, Dönitz withdrew his boats from the American littoral zone. But the admiral did not retreat. He merely relocated the killing grounds. The U-boats shifted their focus back to the mid-Atlantic, to the air gap, a vast, desolate stretch of ocean beyond the range of land-based Allied aircraft from Newfoundland, Iceland, or Northern Ireland. Here, in the Black Pit, the wolfpacks could still operate on the surface with relative impunity, coordinating attacks via radio without fear of immediate aerial retribution. The Allied response to the air gap was a marvel of improvisation and industrial might. The escort carrier, affectionately and derisively known as jeep carriers or baby flat-tops, these vessels were often converted merchant hulls topped with a flight deck. They were slow, unarmored, and rolled heavily in the Atlantic swell, but they brought air power to the middle of the ocean. This innovation allowed for a change in doctrine. Instead of merely tethering destroyers to a convoy in a purely defensive posture, the U.S. Navy formed hunter-killer groups. These task forces, typically centered around an escort carrier and flanked by destroyer escorts, were offensive units. They did not wait for the U-boats to attack. They utilized high-frequency direction finding, HFDF, to triangulate German radio signals and hunted the hunters. One such group was Task Group 22.3, commanded by Captain Daniel V. Gallery aboard the escort carrier USS Guadalcanal. Gallery was a maverick, a man who believed that sinking U-boats was good, but capturing one was better. On June 4, 1944, off the coast of North Africa, his theory was put to the test. The group's destroyers, the USS Chatelaine, Jenks, and Pillsbury, made sonar contact with a submerged target. It was U-505, a Type IXC boat attempting to return home. The destroyers hammered the contact with depth charges and hedgehogs, forward-throwing mortars that exploded only on contact with the hull. The barrage was accurate. Inside U-505, the lights failed, valves ruptured, and the rudder jammed. The panic-stricken crew blew the ballast tanks, and the submarine broke the surface, foaming white water around her conning tower. As the German crew scrambled out of the hatches to abandon ship, they initiated scuttling procedures to send the boat to the bottom. But Captain Gallery had prepared for this moment. He ordered boarding parties away. American sailors, armed with submachine guns and salvage pumps, leaped from whaleboats onto the heaving deck of the U-boat. They went down the hatch into a vessel that was flooding, booby-trapped, and filled with the alien hum of dying machinery. They disconnected the demolition charges, closed the sea valves, and secured the Enigma machines and codebooks. It was the first time the U.S. Navy had captured an enemy man-of-war on the high seas since 1815. The intelligence windfall was catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine, allowing Allied codebreakers to pierce the veil of U-boat communications and allow the Allies to read the Kriegsmarine's mail in near real time. The capture of U-505 was a miracle of seamanship and a devastating breach of operational security for Germany, but it was also a symptom of a dying fleet. By the summer of 1944, the dynamic of the Atlantic War had inverted completely. The hunter had become the hunted. The gray wolves that had once terrorized the eastern seaboard and the Caribbean were now being driven to extinction by a relentless, mechanized Allied offensive that spanned the entire ocean. To understand how a single escort carrier group could run down a submarine in the open ocean, one must look at the technological revolution that occurred between the slaughter of 1942 and the dominance of 1944. The turning point had come a year prior to Gallery's triumph, during a month the Germans would come to call Black May. In May 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic finally broke in favor of the Allies, not through a single decisive battle, but through the accumulation of superior science and industrial output. The air gap, that terrifying void in the mid-Atlantic where convoys were once left to their own devices, had been closed. The arrival of very long-range VLR, B-24 Liberator bombers, flying from bases in Newfoundland, Iceland, and Northern Ireland, meant that a U-boat could no longer surface to recharge its batteries or run its diesel engines without fear of attack from the sky. At the same time, the escort carriers began to roam the convoy routes, their Grumman Avengers and Wildcats pouncing on any periscope that broke the surface. Beneath the waves, the situation was even more dire for the German crews. Allied destroyers and corvettes were now equipped with centimetric radar, a technology small enough to fit on a ship but powerful enough to detect a submarine's conning tower through fog or total darkness. The days of the surface night attack, the preferred tactic of aces like Hardegen and Kretschmer, were over. If a U-boat surfaced, it was seen. If it was seen, it was targeted. Furthermore, the Allies had perfected Huff-Duff, high-frequency direction finding. For years, Admiral Dönitz had coordinated his wolf packs using complex radio signals, directing boats to converge on convoys like a pack of dogs. It was his greatest strength, allowing for massed attacks that overwhelmed escorts. But by 1943, Huff-Duff allowed Allied ships to triangulate those transmissions instantly. When a U-boat commander keyed his transmitter to report a sighting, he was essentially broadcasting his own coordinates to the destroyers racing to kill him. The lethal geometry of anti-submarine warfare had also evolved. The depth charge, a crude weapon that required a destroyer to pass directly over a submerged submarine and drop explosives off the stern, was supplemented by the Hedgehog. This forward-throwing mortar system fired a pattern of 24 contact-fused bombs ahead of the attacking ship. Unlike depth charges, which exploded at a set depth and churned up the water, disrupting sonar contact, Hedgehogs only detonated if they hit the hull of the submarine. A hit meant a kill. A miss left the water undisturbed, allowing the destroyer to maintain sonar contact and try again. The statistical result of these innovations was catastrophic for the Kriegsmarine. In May 1943 alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed. It was an unsustainable rate of attrition. Dönitz, realizing he was sending his crews to useless deaths, temporarily withdrew his forces from the North Atlantic. He would send them back, but the initiative was lost forever. The Battle of the Tonnage had been decided. American shipyards were launching Liberty ships faster than the entire German Navy could sink them. For the individual U-boat sailor, the war became a claustrophobic nightmare. The average life expectancy of a U-boat crewman in the latter half of the war dropped to just 2 patrols. The casualty rate for the service would eventually climb to 75%, the highest of any branch of the German armed forces. Of the 39,000 men who sailed in the U-boat arm, nearly 30,000 never returned. They died in iron coffins, crushed by water pressure, poisoned by chlorine gas from ruptured batteries, or blown apart by the relentless pounding of Allied escorts. Yet, even as the strategic situation became hopeless, the U-boat arm continued to fight with a fanaticism that bordered on the suicidal. They adapted, introducing the Schnorchel, a breathing tube that allowed them to run their diesel engines while submerged at periscope depth. It made them harder to detect by radar, but it turned the boats into humid, stinking prisons where crews lived for weeks without seeing the sun, breathing air thick with diesel fumes and the stench of unwashed bodies. This desperate phase of the war dragged on until the very final hours of the Third Reich. The Battle of the Atlantic did not end with a ceasefire or a treaty. It ended with a final, senseless spasm of violence off the American coast, bringing the war full circle to where Operation Drumbeat had begun. On May 5, 1945, the war in Europe was effectively over. Berlin had fallen to the Red Army. Adolf Hitler had committed suicide in his bunker beneath the ruins of Berlin. Grand Admiral Karl Dönitz, the architect of the U-boat arm and the man who had tried to strangle Britain into submission, was now the head of a crumbling German state. On May 4, he ordered all U-boats to cease hostilities and return to base. The war was over, but in the murky waters off Point Judith, Rhode Island, the war had one final, tragic breath to draw. Kapitänleutnant Helmut Firmsdorf, commanding U-853, was prowling the coastal waters just miles from the American shore. Whether he missed the order, ignored it, or simply chose to fight to the bitter end remains a matter of historical debate. What is certain is that, on the afternoon of May 5, 1945. Less than 3 days before the official surrender, he raised his periscope and spotted the SS Black Point. The Black Point was a collier, a humble merchant ship carrying coal to Boston. She was not a high-value tanker or a troop transport. She was a working-class vessel doing a routine run in waters that were supposed to be safe. At 5:40 p.m., a torpedo from U-853 slammed into her stern. The explosion sheared off the back of the ship, sending the collier down in minutes. 12 men died, the last merchant mariners to be killed in U.S. waters during the conflict. The response from the U.S. Navy was immediate and furious. This was not 1942. There was no hesitation, no lack of resources, and no mercy. A hunter-killer group led by the destroyer escort USS Atherton and the frigate USS Moberly converged on the contact. They did not merely drive the U-boat off, they pinned it to the sea floor. For hours, the American ships relentlessly pounded the position with depth charges and hedgehogs. They dropped pattern after pattern, churning the Atlantic into a frothing cauldron of white water and mud. The next morning, divers from a rescue vessel descended into the gloom to verify the kill. They found U-853 lying on the bottom, her hull shattered, a steel tomb for Firmsdorf and his entire crew. It was a senseless waste of life on both sides, a violent punctuation mark at the end of the longest campaign of the war. When victory in Europe was officially declared on May 8, the Atlantic finally fell silent. Across the ocean, a surreal scene played out. U-boats, the terrifying gray wolves that had haunted the nightmares of Allied seamen for 6 years, began to surface. They flew black flags of surrender or the white ensign of the Royal Navy. They were met not by torpedoes, but by the very escorts that had hunted them. The German crews, pale, bearded, and reeking of diesel and sweat, emerged from their iron casings to breathe fresh air for the first time in weeks. They were shepherded into ports like Londonderry and Portsmouth, passing the rows of Liberty ships and tankers that had survived the onslaught. The scale of the victory and the cost was staggering. The Battle of the Atlantic was not won by a single decisive stroke like Midway or El Alamein. It was a war of attrition, a battle of the tonnage, won by the slide rule as much as the depth charge. The Allies had simply outbuilt the destruction. American shipyards, operating around the clock, had produced tonnage faster than the U-boats could sink it. By the end of the war, the United States had launched over 2,700 Liberty ships alone, ugly but effective vessels that clogged the sea lanes with cargo. But the ledger of loss was horrific. The U-boats had sunk approximately 3,500 Allied merchant ships and 175 warships. They had sent over 14 million tons of essential supplies to the bottom of the ocean, aluminum for aircraft, oil for tanks, food for a starving population. The human cost, however, is where the true tragedy of the Atlantic lies. For the German U-boat arm, the war was a catastrophe. Of the 1,177 U-boats built, 783 were lost to enemy action or accidents. The casualty rate was appalling. Out of roughly 39,000 officers and men who served in the U-boat force, 30,003 were killed. It was a death rate of 75%, the highest of any service branch in any nation during the war. These men, often volunteers, had sailed out knowing that the odds of returning were mathematically non-existent, yet they sailed until the very end. On the Allied side, the burden of the war was borne most heavily by the civilians of the merchant marine. These were the men who kept the lifeline open when the U-boats were at their zenith. They had no foxholes to dig, no rear areas to retreat to. When a tanker was torpedoed, the sea itself became the enemy, a freezing, burning expanse that offered little hope of survival. Over 36,000 Allied merchant mariners perished. The statistics for the United States Merchant Marine are particularly sobering. Despite being civilians, they suffered a casualty rate of 1 in 26, higher than the U.S. Navy, higher than the Army, and higher than the Marine Corps. 8,651 American mariners died ensuring that the armies of liberation could fight in Europe. They died in the black pit of the mid-Atlantic, in the icy waters of the Murmansk Run, and within sight of the boardwalks of New Jersey and the beaches of Florida. For decades after the war, their sacrifice was often overlooked, their status as veterans debated, but without them, the invasion of Europe would have been impossible. The victory in the Atlantic was the single, non-negotiable prerequisite for the invasion of Fortress Europe. Without the secure sea lanes, there is no D-Day, no Lend-Lease for the Soviet Union, and no strategic bombing campaign. The Atlantic was the foundation upon which the entire Allied war effort rested, a victory bought not with a single stroke of tactical genius, but with the grim endurance of thousands of men who sailed into the dark, knowing the odds were stacked against them. But to truly understand the magnitude of this achievement, and the sheer precipice upon which the Allied cause teetered, we must look back from the industrialized dominance of 1944 to the desperate scarcity of 1940, when Britain stood alone, and the ocean floor was littered with the wreckage of Allied shipping. In those darkest hours, the war was not won by overwhelming firepower, but by the simple, terrifying refusal to let the lifeline break. If you would like more war stories from World War II, please like this video and subscribe to our channel.